Welcome to the first session of our social psychology module. Looking forward to be spending the next 5 weeks with you going through this really big branch of psychology. It will of course just be a first taster, but I'm very much looking forward to discussing some of these topics in class with you. Social psychology. One of the good early definitions by Gordon Allport says it's scientific investigation of how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals are affected by the presence, actual or imagined, of others. So in very basic terms, what we're trying to do is to explore how people are affected by other people, but very specifically to explore that using scientific research methods. So I think social psychology is one of the most exciting branches of psychology, because most lecturers are going to tell you that about their own part, so we're all biased there. But social psychology really has some of the most important questions about what it means to be human at the center of what we're studying here. Because humans are social animals. Aristotle coined that phrase more than 2,000 years ago. And it has of course become only more true with the theory of evolution and the research into evolution that has shown that we are really animals, that we're really quite close to animals. So it's important to understand and to explain what sets us apart. And based on, let's say, quite a wide consensus, it's our social abilities, ultimately what we're studying here. Because humans are uniquely capable of coordination. To me, one of the really powerful examples of that is Wikipedia, which I'm sure you're all using. Shouldn't trust all the details too much. It's an amazing example of human coordination. It's people from all over the world in all kinds of languages working together for free to bring human knowledge together. There are many other examples. Linux, the computer software that most web servers are running on, is another example of people coming together from all over the world, all kinds of backgrounds, and creating a really unique piece of creativity, a really unique product. So we're capable of really impressive coordination as humans. And if you're curious, if you think about what that really means, then some research questions come out of that. So what are people's motivations to participate in these projects? Who are those people? How are benefits shared? Of course, our ability to coordinate isn't always for good. In fact, it very often isn't. The Holocaust was one of the starting points for social psychology, because it showed some very profound aspects of what we are as social animals in a very lethal combination. It showed that we are highly able to coordinate a major evil undertaking, and also that we have something in us that can motivate such an undertaking. So human coordination is a really unique ability, obviously used for good and evil. And a lot of early social psychology was very much about understanding the evil. How could humans do something like murdering 6 million Jews? And what does that tell us about who we are? Of course, sometimes coordination fails. Ultimately, no one wants to live in a rubbish heap. Still, we have litter problems. No one wants to be very frustrated about group projects in school or elsewhere, and still we quite often are. So obviously a part of social psychology is also to explain when coordination works and when it doesn't. And then hopefully help us to learn how to make it work in situations that we care about. And these are really old questions. It's not a history of philosophy course. I still just want to point out a couple of people that have thought about this in interesting ways. The two big thinkers in the European tradition are Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan, and basically his argument was very much about, so his most famous quote or thought is that in the state of nature, life was brutish, nasty, and short. So humans in the state of nature would just be in violence. And what was needed for a stable life is a powerful Leviathan, a powerful state dominating humans. Rousseau had a somewhat different view of that and believed a lot more in the potential of humans to be good. So this book that I have here, Emil on Education, was his treatise on how education should work, which was all about liberating people, giving them freedom, rather than creating dominance. In the Eastern tradition, we have these two leading Confucian thinkers, Mencius and Chunzi, who were active pretty much exactly the time of Aristotle, so more than 2,000 years ago, and had a similar debate with Mencius saying, well, actually, we have this fundamental goodness in human nature. And Chunzi saying, well, that's not true. The fundamental driver is greed, and greed leads to conflict. So these questions are really old. It's quite interesting how similar the thinking in different traditions has been around these questions. And it makes sense that the answers are uncertain. However, the promise of scientific social psychology is, of course, to deliver somewhat more certain answers. And I'll talk in the next section of the lecture about how that works, how to go about it. But still, it's important to recognize from the very beginning that science done right doesn't reveal the truth. We don't have a method to arrive at the truth. What science is all about is reducing uncertainty, excluding some possibilities. Well, we know that certain things are just not the case. Sailing around the world has definitely shown that the Earth is not flat, so that's an excluded possibility, and it allows us to build reasonable theories that are not just speculation, but based on some level of evidence. However, science is not always done right. Something that will stay with us throughout this module is the replication crisis, the fact that a lot of exciting psychological findings are published, and then people try to do the same research again and fail. And towards the end of the course, we might have a bit of a discussion whether that's really about how science is done, or about how science is read and understood. And a really important thing to think about is that we always have to make this leap from observation to interpretation. So we observe certain data in an experiment or something like that, but we don't always draw the right conclusions as to what that means. For me, one of the most powerful examples of that is research into surgeries, where for a long time, the very reasonable assumption was that if you want to know whether knee surgery, for example, does good for the patient, you would look at the people who get knee surgery, you would compare them to people who are not getting the surgery, and if the people who got the surgery have less pain, then probably the surgery did something positive. More recent research has shown that an alternative explanation would be that people who got a surgery feel that something positive happened to them, expect that a surgery would help them, and then these psychological mechanisms make them feel better. In that case, it might well be that it's necessary to do something like surgery, but it wouldn't tell us that any of the details are really helpful. And I'm sure you've heard about this idea of a placebo effect, that psychological expectations make medicine effective in the context of drugs. New evidence has shown that it also exists in the context of surgical interventions. Of course, it's harder to research there. So even if our data is correct, it's often not so easy to figure out what that data means. However, answers to these old big questions have very strong relevance, so it's worth studying them. Because clearly we somehow need to shape institutions. We need to figure out how to educate individuals. And on a personal level, we need to figure out how to deal with each other. And I'll go into that in more detail in the next section, but there are reasons why this is more complex than what we do in the natural sciences. Because beliefs matter. Beliefs matter because they can quickly become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we have beliefs based on scientific truth, that humans can't be trusted, that humans try to cheat, well, you can think about how that can turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. And negative self-fulfilling prophecies can work through what's called nocebos. That's just the opposite of placebos. So if I expect that something will have a negative outcome, my body might do a lot to help me sustain that expectation. When you might have had it with some food that you weren't quite sure about, you thought might maybe make you sick. And then you thought about it so much until it actually made you sick, even though it was completely fine. So just based on that expectation. And on a more interpersonal level, there are these issues around selective perception. So if I have stereotypes about a certain group, I might only notice things that fit the stereotypes. And that might then lead me to reinforcing cycles. So I only notice negative things, I avoid contact, I then enter interactions in a very suspicious way, and thereby create more negative encounters. So it's really important to not have kind of unnecessary negative expectations. And of course, it's also really important not to be naive and just believe in the goodness of humans, because that's what we like to believe. Because then we're back at the starting point of social psychology, trying to understand why evil things happen in the world. So how do we figure out these answers? That's where I want to take a step back and talk a bit more systematically about how science and psychological research is done. And often it can be helpful in that to look at the most basic case of science, which most philosophers of science take physics to be. Physics often asks questions that can have rather clear answers. So here the question: what travels faster through space, light or sound? Think about it. Do you know it? Are you sure, and how do you know? You might know because someone told you, but you are also able to know through direct observation. In a thunderstorm, you look at the sky, you will see the lightning long before you hear the thunder. So there can be a clear observation of data in the real world that allows you to know for sure. Another scientific question that we might be interested in social psychology is the question of gender equality. Are women given the same opportunities at work than men? Out there in the world is probably, again, some true answer, yes or no. But are we 100% sure of that answer? How could we be? And clearly this is a bit different for various reasons. So I want to go through some reasons why studying the social world might be different from studying the physical world. The first set of reasons are about studying people, which isn't very trivial. So if we study people, they have their own opinions. If we ask someone to report about gender relations in their workplace, they're not going to be an instrument that we can read some facts of, but it will be people sharing their opinions. They're social beings, so they care about others, about what others think. They want to think positively of themselves, so most people will not report things that they're ashamed of. They want to be liked by us as the researchers. They can, if they want to, they can hold information back or give us wrong information. And there are certain topics that people don't want to talk about. So the point of this just is that it can be quite a bit harder to study people than to study sound and light and those nice things in the natural world. Also, quite importantly, people can be harmed. So you have this whole dimension of research ethics. And if you've studied social psychology before, you'll certainly remember some of the big famous experiments that didn't take this into account. So we'll be discussing that as we go through the course as well. At a slightly bigger level, there are a couple of differences between the social world and the physical world that are really worth bearing in mind when we're trying to think about social science and social psychology. The first would be that things really change. So even if we find a definite, true answer to our question about gender relations, that answer might change and will hopefully change in a couple of years. Related to that, it's quite hard to know how far to generalize. If we study anything, if we learn anything about differences between men and women in London today, how much can we really learn from that about gender relations in general? Again, in some natural sciences, this is much easier. If I know something about sound and light waves, then that will be true pretty much anywhere in the universe. So one of the debates we should be having in social psychology is how far do our findings generalize? And obviously the world is less deterministic. What is there now doesn't determine what happens next. That is what deterministic means. But what happens now might influence it, but then people also have free will and have the ability to choose. So it's an interesting space to explore. But it's a tough area to do research in. So what might research look like? There are some strong reasons why in all of psychology we prefer experimental methods. We'll discuss that again and again as well. And the ideal experimental method in the eyes of many early and traditional psychologists are lab experiments. So you bring people into a room, difficult these days, but usually still done in lots of psychology departments. So you bring people into a room, give them a very specific task, and then observe how they perform and measure some very specific outcomes. So here are these two men, at least back in the day, they usually were men, have some interaction task. They can only interact through these computers, so it's very easy to measure how much information they exchange, for example. The alternative to that is to do field experiments. So to do experiments that are much more embedded into people's everyday life. An example for an area where lots of field experiments are done is in nutrition. If we try to get people to eat more healthily, a lot of research has to be about how to arrange food options in a cafeteria, how to label food options in a cafeteria. Doing these things in a lab would be much harder. So field experiments are just about doing experiments embedded in everyday life. The big advantage of a lab experiment is that we have this very high level of control. We can measure exactly what's going on, and we can be sure that nothing else is going on. However, that makes them quite artificial. And people who are sitting in the psychology lab are usually there because they want to take part in the experiment, advance science, and thus respond to the demands of the situations. So it can be difficult to figure out whether to trust any of the findings. Field experiments, on the other hand, are so-called ecologically valid because they take place in the real world. However, we have this lower level of control. So if I do this experiment in a cafeteria, I ultimately don't know if my participants come from a sports practice and there's a really craving carbs, or if they're coming from some other setting where it's easier to eat healthily. So less control, and that then gives rise to these questions of internal validity, which you're going to be discussing in research methods. It basically just means whether I can be sure that what I observe is caused by the variables that I'm manipulating. So are changes in food intake actually caused by the kinds of labels I put on the food? And then there are many things that we can't study experimentally in social psychology. There are many things that we really need to study through surveys by asking people how they feel about certain things, how they experience certain things. The majority of research is done in that way. And it's good because it allows us to obtain a lot of data quite easily. And because we have a lot of data, often from a lot of different types of people, it allows us to draw general conclusions about a larger group. However, if we do the data collection, especially face-to-face, there might be a strong experimental effect. Because again, people only want to tell us certain things, only want to admit to certain things. But the most important thing here is that surveys will never tell us about causality. So usually we're interested in why something happens. So staying with the gender discrimination example, we see that women get worse performance ratings in a job. We might want to know why that is. A survey isn't really going to tell us. A survey is going to tell us what people think about it, but that's a different thing. If we're really interested in causality, we need something like experiments. So looking at how social psychologists might study a question like this equal opportunities question, I want to show you an experiment that I think is quite interesting. So it was conducted about 20 years ago, and they sent 2 CVs to psychology academics in the US. And then each of those 2 CVs had once a male name and once a female name on them. And the question was, if we look at the identical CV that just has a different name, will the male applicant be more likely to be hired than the female applicant? And it's a fairly complicated chart, so I want to go through it step by step, actually. Let's only look at the two bars on the left. So the female and male job applicant. Those were fictional people like me, early career researchers who just applied for one of their first jobs. And there we can see that among the females, just over half got rejected, and among the males who had exactly the same CV, about 2/3 got hired. There's a very strong evidence here that there is gender-based discrimination going on, because there was no other difference between these female job applicants and male job applicants. Interestingly, if we look at the two columns on the right-hand side of the graph, we see a very different pattern. Those were older applicants, again, fictional applicants, who applied for the tenure track, so basically to become full professors. And here we see no difference. Most women make it, most men make it. So why would that be? And that's now a moment where we can look at how science would work. So we have this observation. We see quite specific evidence for gender discrimination in one situation, no gender discrimination in the other situation. So our question might be, why do we see evidence for gender discrimination among early career researchers, but not when it comes to hiring professors? In order to be able to do a scientific experiment there, we need to come up with a testable hypothesis. We need to have an idea of why this might be. And now there could be lots of different ideas. One example, one suggestion that was actually put forward by the researchers in the paper that I just showed was that there is a bias to ascribe potential or more potential to men than women. So when there are gaps in the CV, recruiters might more easily say, well, the man can learn on the job, the woman can't. If there are no gaps on the CV, or rather if the situation doesn't allow one to recruit for potential, then there's no gender imbalance. So the hypothesis might be that there's a difference in the potential people see that's associated with gender. So we could design an experiment to explicitly test this, and the most simple experiment would be to really ask people about potential. You give them a CV and you say, well, where is the person really right now, and where could the person develop to? If we have the two ratings, we might actually see that men and women are rated equally on where they are right now. If that is the case, we would have very clear evidence that this prejudice about potential is the explanation for the effect we are seeing. So we would run this experiment, ask people, run some statistical analysis on the results, and conclude that either our data corresponds to that explanation or it doesn't. In either case, there would clearly be more work to do. If it does work out, we might want to figure out what the boundary conditions are. If it doesn't work out, we obviously want to test a different explanation. This is the scientific circle that we need to work our way around. That sounds, at least conceptually, hopefully quite clear, but it's really not easy to do, and things go wrong quite regularly, and I want to point them out very early in the course, because I want you to watch out for these pitfalls in your readings, and to challenge some of the evidence that you see by thinking, did I follow the scientific process, the scientific method? And did I make any of these common mistakes? So what are the most common mistakes? I think there are three. One is around selective publishing and reading. So clearly progress in this circle depends on transparency. If I run my experiment that I just described, I need to be willing to publish my results whether or not they fit the hypothesis. And ideally, people who want to do research in the same field should be willing to read my results, whether or not it supports my hypothesis. Because otherwise, the same unsuccessful experiments are done again and again, and a couple of times when a false hypothesis is just accidentally applicable to a certain data set, that gets published and people start chasing this wrong finding. So one thing is the selective publishing. Related to that is this misunderstanding what probabilistic conclusions really mean. So the question we always ask in analyzing data in psychology is, how likely would this have been if there was no effect? So if I see that lots of blonde children are born to blonde parents and I don't know anything about genetics, the question I should ask is, how likely would I be to observe this if there was no association? If I just observe a very small group of parents and children, I can't be very confident. In that small group, all the blonde parents might have blonde children. But that might just be due to chance. If I observe a very large group, it becomes less likely that that would just be due to chance. However, it's always a probabilistic conclusion. And if we forget about that and just say, oh, well, now we ran one study where we saw this effect, so that's great, let's move on and say this is established knowledge, then we really make a mistake. Any one study can give us a reason to think that a certain effect might well be there, that a certain effect is worth studying further, but it will never establish it. So it's really important to look at the evidence together. And that's actually one of the tasks for you in studying social psychology. I'm, of course, always presenting specific studies to give you a flavor for how research is done. Textbooks also present you with specific studies. If you then want to write an essay or you want to even decide whether to believe certain findings, it's really your job to look at the evidence more broadly, because those might just be interesting, fascinating studies that are not replicated, that just had those results due to chance. Because I'm trying to select studies that have been replicated and that are trustworthy. But just seeing that a study has shown something once shouldn't give us a lot of confidence into that result. The third common issue is conflating steps in this scientific method cycle, which is explaining data. So if I just look at some data set, I see a pattern in the data set. I say, well, that pattern might be there. And then I try to publish that and say, Well, I looked at the students at St. Mary's. I just looked at all kinds of characteristics, and it just happened to be that ones who played Pokemon Go a couple of years ago were the ones who paid more attention in class. That might be an interesting observation. It can't be a scientific finding, because remember that the cycle goes from an hypothesis to an experiment or other data collection. So if I observe this and I think this is a really interesting effect, then I need to go somewhere else and look for a new data set and see whether that new data set agrees with my hypothesis or doesn't. So if you see some interesting findings about relationships in surveys, it's really worth asking whether there was an hypothesis first and then a test of the hypothesis, or if there was just a lot of data, a lot of digging through the data for things that might potentially be interesting. Our plan for the next 2.5 sessions maybe is to move from the self out towards groups. Because ultimately what we want to understand is how we function as psychological beings in the context of groups. So what is the self? What are we even talking about there? William James, who's often called the founder of American psychology, challenged this focus on understanding the self. So he said, properly speaking, a man has as many selves as acquaintances. So every one of you watching this will have some opinion, some impression of me. When I interact with you, I will get to learn something about what these impressions are. And all of these contribute to my sense of self. So there can't be just one of them. Conversely, one of the current leading social psychologists, Roy Baumeister, said actually that doesn't make that much sense conceptually. So clearly that it's all true, but the concept of self loses meaning if a person has multiple selves. The whole idea of self is to figure out who I am, and I'm somehow whole, so there needs to be some kind of one self. The reason why I'm starting from here is because I'm going to be talking a lot about multiple selves, about multiple identities. But I want to flag that as in most things, there are debates about how those aspects should be called. Are there multiple selves? Are there facets of one self? And there are also debates about the content. How important is it for us as individuals to have one integrated self? Or is it just okay to have lots of different aspects to an identity? Since we are moving towards groups, what I want to talk about is the social emergence of the self. From a couple of different perspectives that all try to explain how our self is obviously not something we are born with. It's also not something that we come to find as individuals, but it's something that's created in a social context, in a group. The first idea here is symbolic interactionism that actually comes maybe more from an anthropological background than originally a social psychological background. But the idea is that meaning and identity are only created through interactions. There are obviously no words outside of interactions. Language only acquires meaning in a social context. But also there are no categories that really give us a sense of self and identity without interaction. That's very obvious for many of the categories. I'm German. Germanness wouldn't be a thing at all without interactions with other Germans and non-Germans. So it's a category that only gains any kind of meaning through social interaction. And these interactions, according to Mead, always take place through the use of symbols, and those symbols only acquire meaning in interaction. Words are one obvious example for such symbols, but there are many more. There are ways of being, there are other greeting rituals. But knowledge of these symbols then again becomes an important part of ourselves and of the groups. And that clearly implies that our understanding of self is very much related to how we're seen by others and how those categories that make up the self are mutually understood. A more hands-on approach to that very much is statued in social psychology. This idea of social comparisons. So if we look at this little boy here, is he short or tall? How would he know? He can only know by having a friend who confidently says, well, I'm tall. In that case, he can decide, okay, then I'm short. In the absence of these comparisons, the word short wouldn't mean anything. And that's actually true for many of the concepts that we care about in terms of identities. Being intelligent, being attractive, being generous, all these things are really only meaningful in comparison to some kind of standard or to some specific other people. Leon Festinger, who did a lot of the early work on social comparisons, introduced this idea that there are two fundamentally different types of comparisons. Upward comparisons, where we look up to people who are better on some trait that matters to us, and then ideally feel inspired by them. Conversely, downward social comparison is then looking at people who are worse off than we are, and functionally, in a positive sense, that can be self-enhancing. It can protect us from excessive expectations. But of course, both of these directions can also be problematic. Festinger framed upward social comparison very positively. It has become seen a lot more critically with the rise of social media. As you probably know better than I do, a lot of what's happening on Instagram and co is upward social comparison with people who have better holidays, better looks, whatever, which then leads to fear of missing out as much as to possibly aspirations to do better ourselves. Still, in either direction, for better or worse, our sense of self is constructed by comparing ourselves with others and assessing where we stand in these comparisons. And then the third way of thinking about the self is what Turner developed as self-categorization theory. And the key idea behind that is that basically any part of our identity can be seen as concentric, where we have something that's really quite uniquely us. That thing generalizes into a group identity, which then can generalize even more broadly. And when we look at examples for that, it becomes clear that identities are multiple. The idea here is less inclusive, more inclusive. Inclusive matches onto the circles we just saw before. So US and Mary's psychology students, that's a fairly small circle. Within that, of course, you can make it smaller. You might be living in a certain hall of residence. There's a part of your identity that's really quite specific and shared by rather few other people. Depending on the context, that's what really matters. If you meet another St. Mary's psychology student on campus, and you're both living on campus, maybe the most important question is, well, what block are you in? If you meet another student somewhere in the country, you would probably connect on that higher level. You would not say, well, I'm a St. Mary's psychology student from whatever your blocks are called, but you would say, I'm a student at St. Mary's. And then maybe when you're meeting people in a completely different background, the thing that you would see as defining yourself might be that you are a student rather than a professional, a retiree, whatever it might be. So the point here is that we often tend to distinguish ourselves from people by just going one level more specific and find commonalities at the lowest possible level. Usually in interacting with other St. Mary's students, you probably wouldn't just say, well, we're just students in the UK. That probably wouldn't be the shared identity that you perceive. A different example for that would be that in many settings, if you care about football, in many settings, you would probably identify as a fan of your particular team. However, probably not always. If the World Cup comes up, or if you need to discuss the TV schedule, maybe the identity of being a football fan becomes more relevant, or maybe even a sports fan. In these different group memberships, which kind of group membership is relevant in a specific situation can have very big consequences. So there's this paper by Levine and colleagues that is on the webpage for this module, and I would encourage you to actually read it as an example for a very interesting study in the area that we're going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks. So they wanted to figure out, well, if we have these different levels of identity, how are they related to helping? So in the first study, they recruited a bunch of Arsenal fans, got them into the lab, and got them to affirm that identity. Basically, they filled in a questionnaire that was all aimed at getting them to say how much they care about Arsenal. Then they sent them out of the lab. The actual experiment happened. In that experiment, they came past an injured Arsenal fan. So an accomplice, a confederate of the researchers who was sitting on the floor holding his leg. 92% of the Arsenal fans who had just affirmed that they are Arsenal fans helped this injured fellow Arsenal fan. Very nice. Clearly, it's good to help other people. However, when the other fan was a Liverpool fan, unfortunately, only 30% helped. So a huge drop here that since they were the same Confederates in the same setting, just distinguished by their t-shirts, a huge drop that was just caused by them not being part of the present in-group. So they ran the experiment again, and that's where it becomes interesting. They recruited Arsenal fans again, but didn't get them to affirm how much they like Arsenal, but got them to affirm how much they like to be a football fan. And they sent them off again, and this time there wasn't much of a difference between the teams that they encountered. When they met an injured Arsenal fan, most helped. When they met an injured Liverpool fan, again, most helped. In both cases, they also had the Arsenal fans walk past, some Arsenal fans walk past another injured person who was not a football fan, who was just wearing this kind of t-shirt. And in both experiments, most people didn't help there. So between 20 and 30% helped this non-football fan. So this sense of self, am I an Arsenal fan, a football fan, can clearly shape a lot about how we interact with others. And that will be our focus for the next couple of weeks. So some takeaways from today. The first is that I hope that you got a sense of what social psychology is about. It's really about figuring out how people influence and engage with each other. And I strongly believe that with that it can create knowledge that shapes the world and that needs to shape the world. So it's a really important field. The scientific method is at the heart of experimental social psychology, which is what we will be mostly studying. There are some other approaches that we'll look at towards the end. And it's completely okay if you do social psychology in a way that's more inspired by anthropology, for example. But what is not okay and what we should just be very critical of are sloppy uses of the experimental method, or of the scientific method, rather. And finally, the point I want to leave you with is this nice quote of No Man is an Island. So identity is inherently social. And that deep sociability can lead to good and bad outcomes. And our focus for the next couple of weeks is to figure out when it leads to good outcomes and when it leads to bad outcomes. So please make sure to join the live sessions and to have a look at the materials on the webpage and bring any questions to the sessions. I'm looking forward to discussing them with you. So see you there.